guys, let's dive right in. They gave us 30 minutes for this panel, and these folks aren't talkative at all. So it won't be a challenge, I'm sure. But I would love to hear from each of you your thoughts on 2024, not just the election, or what you think about the major candidates or major parties, but what you think about especially the state of media, because so many of you interact with the media. And Amber, I will start with you.
Sure. Well, I think it's become pretty obvious that if we didn't already know, the media is entirely in the tank for the Democrats. I mean, just look at what's been happening over the past month with Kamala Harris being coronated as the new nominee for the Democratic Party, and there's not been a single question asked of her by the media or questions asked by the media about how this process that was so undemocratic was allowed to take place. They're not clamoring for her to sit down for interviews, and they've actually been retconning her entire time as vice president. They haven't asked the question, okay, you say you're going to do this in your next 4 years. What have you been doing for the past 3.5? They have decided suddenly that she's no longer the border czar when Biden put her in that position in 2021. They've been treating her simultaneously like she's the architect of all of these wonderful Biden policies, which we know how those turned out, but also somehow separate from the administration on anything that could potentially be negative. So the media is playing a huge role in trying to sanitize everything that's happened over the past 4 years, certainly, and then specifically over the past month. So you're not just running against Democrats if you're a Republican, you're also running against basically the entire media establishment.
George, your thoughts on the election and the media landscape?
Of course, well, I'll confine myself mostly to foreign policy issues because those are the ones I think about the most. I would raise for you that there's a famous political scientist, Peter Beaver, who described how the United States, once every 4 years, its federal government lobotomizes itself. And of course, what he meant by that is there's a change in administrations, and even if there's an incumbent, there's quite a bit of turnover. So, I think that on the kind of national security, foreign policy area, we have one candidate, President Trump, whose views are somewhat well-defined. And then we have Vice President Harris, where there's a great deal of mystery. And so yesterday, I raised one of the books of one of her big foreign policy advisors, Philip Gordon. That book is Losing the Long Game, but I think there's an investment that should be made that will not be made by the United States media in trying to ascertain, what her views are in terms of big themes. And so I think it behooves people like us to kind of talk and ask questions that raise those key points. But we're, I think, wrong to assume that a Biden administration is going to be the kind of roadmap for what a Harris administration would be in foreign policy. I think that's actually quite dangerous.
Kaylee.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult for those of us who are in the media to ascertain what happens this election cycle, not just because so many unprecedented things have happened, but because when you're in the media bubble, it's very difficult to step outside of it and get a good grasp on reality and what voters are actually thinking on a daily basis. And this has been especially true since Kamala Harris has sort of taken over the top of the Democratic ticket. If you would have asked me a couple months ago where this election was going, I probably would have said it would be Donald Trump by a landslide. But now the prevailing narrative is that Kamala Harris has a ton of momentum, that all of a sudden the Democrats have a much better chance than they would have under Joe Biden. But to be honest, I don't know how true that is, because a lot of that is manufactured hype from the media that has a vested interest in making sure that she does have momentum. So it is a challenge for those of us who are sort of within the Beltway, who are reading about this stuff on a daily basis, to get a good look on what's happening. And that's entirely the fault of the legacy media, which refuses to do its job honestly.
CARRIE.
Yes, so I'm with the Independent Women's Forum. You heard from my colleague Mae Melman on the previous panel, and we're still in denial that you left us, Hadley. But I am here from the media. Over and over, I get asked, well, shouldn't you support Kamala because she's a woman, it's history? And I'm just like, that is the most sexist question, because you should never support a candidate simply because of their gender. And so that's one thing that I'm looking as a commentator and a journalist, questions that I don't see the media asking about, for example, the fact that yesterday the Taliban passed a law in Afghanistan that prohibits women from speaking in the public, showing any skin at all, and looking at men that they aren't related to. There's also the fact that along the southern border, depending on your statistics, anywhere between 30 to 70% of women will be sexually assaulted as they're coming up through the southern border. Where is the feminist Kamala here? Nobody is asking these questions. And so I think throwing that back, I think also from a gender standpoint, that there's a risk of backfiring to really alienate men away from Kamala, because there's sort of this feminization in the media that I see over and over. One other point that I would point out on when it comes to the economy, I'm not hearing the media asking about the effects of price control, because that's what Kamala has promoted, is price control. And similar to what Jonathan Turley said earlier, any regime that tries restricting freedom of speech fails. Any regime in history, we're talking thousands of years of human history that have tried price controls, it always fails. And so where's the media on that? Not hearing it, but that's why we're here.
Brad?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think the traditional media landscape looks very familiar. You have a mainstream media that is thoroughly in the tank of the Democratic candidate, carrying water for Kamala Harris in all sorts of ways, from defending her very radical and economically illiterate price control schemes and kind of gaslighting us and saying they're not price controls, but also they will control prices. Seriously. And then so you have them going kind of full of attack mode, defending Kamala Harris, and then of course you have conservative media, which is in the tank for Trump. But what I think is more interesting, that's a familiar landscape, is the social media landscape. Because I report closely on TikTok and on internet phenomenons and trends, and Kamala Harris is winning online. We might not like it, that might be bad news, but you have to acknowledge that. Gen Z and young voters were completely uninterested in Joe Biden. They had lost all support for him. They thought he was way too old. He was not doing well with them at all. But when Kamala came in, they have very successfully rebranded her online as some kind of iconic slay queen brat on TikTok. And that's concerning to me, to see so many young people going hook, line, and sinker on her really radical agenda. The media's tried to recast her as a moderate, but she was ranked as one of the most liberal members of the US Senate. And I think she's only gotten more radical since then. But we can't ignore that. But at the same time, I think we can take a little bit of solace in the fact that those people don't really vote. So unless something changes radically with Gen Z's voting patterns, the fact that Kamala is winning the online game right now, which I think is just an indisputable reality if you're in those spaces, is not potentially ultimately that consequential, but it is just frightening for the future trajectory of the country regardless.
Tom?
Thank you.
To build on that, obviously the media is in the tank generally for Vice President Harris, but at the same time, I think Donald Trump has made things a lot worse for himself, and certainly people in his campaign would say this behind the scenes, by refusing to focus as much on policy as he does on personality. And it's clear that the Democrats have got that and know they've got under his skin. You see those convention speeches, Barack Obama with the hand movements, the little line, and Trump can't resist going for that. And I don't think a lot of those independent voters that frankly were with him, probably over Biden, prefer that to him talking about price gouging, which again is a socialist model that's failed everywhere, or the absence of a functioning border, or instability in the world, or his respective economic record. I mean, this should be a no-brainer kind of policy platform for him to take. And I suppose we'll see at the debate, but you can bet that Kamala Harris is going to be needling him with personal attacks to try and get him off that stuff. And again, to Brad's point, I think that does particularly, it affects independent voters, it affects younger voters who may not vote, but independent voters do vote. And so Trump has to bear in some of the responsibility here, I think, for the decline he's facing at the moment.
You just can't get political analysis this good anywhere else. I just feel like as a moderator, what a treat to get to talk with our Blankley fellows. So smart, so polished, all of you. I mean, this is network TV stuff right here. But my next question is, I want to get to something that we talk about sometimes at the Steamboat Institute, which is hope. We don't want to despair. It's easy enough in an election year, and it's easy enough to say, well, the media's in the tank for Kamala, obviously. But I want to ask each Blankley fellow, what is something that gives you hope? And let's try to avoid the answer of like a particular electoral outcome. Let's go for something deeper or different than an electoral outcome. What's something that gives you hope?
Well, I think in the media landscape specifically, there's a lot of hope in the fact that independent media has become a much more force in that landscape because of the rise of digital media. As much as the internet has brought a lot of societal ills, it also has the benefit of creating a more democratized media marketplace. And there's a lot of people who are able to be independent journalists, there's new outlets that are coming up, and the corporate media model is dying. I mean, if you just look at the major broadcast networks, their nightly newscasts get maybe 2 or 3 million viewers a day. And then, talking to Catherine Harris yesterday, she pointed out one of her investigations that she put on X got 23 million views. And I think this can only be good for the conservative movement, because this is a new landscape that is predicated on the idea of free speech and open inquiry and having these debates out in the public square. I think Elon Musk buying X was one of the best things to happen to our country in the past couple of years. And I hope that he stays committed to keeping that a platform for free speech. But I think it's very encouraging that there are so many new upstart media outlets and journalists who are able to have these platforms. I think that gives us a much greater way to get access directly to the people without going through those corporate channels, which are very much captured by liberal groupthink.
George, something hopeful.
Well, I think that in the realm of foreign policy, there's often a kind of period of waiting or a kind of slack in the system that develops right before an American presidential election. And I certainly saw this, when I was in Odessa in Ukraine this last summer, speaking at the Black Sea Security Forum. There's a lot of concern even before President Biden stepped out of the nomination of what the policy was going to be after the election took place. And so I'm hopeful in the sense that many of these kind of stalled decisions and many of these kind of avoidance of decisive action that the United States government is taking, that may shift after the election. And so that's, I think, something important and potentially positive. I'll also say on the media front that I think those of us who were stunned by what took place in the kind of spring after the October 7th attacks across university campuses, that there's a kind of organized community of people with a counter message to deliver. And so I was deeply concerned about what's going to happen on college campuses this fall. But as I speak with kind of savvy conservatives in media, I think there may be a means by which you can describe those issues in different ways, because it certainly was an onslaught in social media last spring on those issues.
Kaylee.
I think that, and I think Donald Trump deserves a lot of credit for this. I think one big area of hope is that the public sees the media for what it is, a propaganda machine. And I think of even a couple weeks ago, you had CNN's Caitlin Collins on Stephen Colbert, and he sort of made an off comment about, oh, well, you guys do a great job of delivering the facts straight up. And his own audience laughed at him because they don't believe that either, and they're extremely far left. And I mean, we even see what happened with Joe Biden. The media did a phenomenal job of covering up Joe Biden's true cognitive state for the past several years. But all it took was one real moment on a debate stage for the voters to burst through that bubble and recognize what was happening. And at that point, there was no saving Joe Biden. Those voters were never going back, no matter how hard the media tried to spin it. And so that's when the media eventually gave up as well and started calling for him to drop out. So I do think that the landscape has significantly changed in that, yes, we are dealing with a media that is in bed with the Democratic Party, that has a narrative to push, but I think voters are awake to that now and are much less likely to be, hoodwinked by it.
Awake, not woke, right?
Right, yes.
All right,
big
Carrie,
difference.
what's something that gives you hope?
Yeah, similar. I think the pendulum has swung too far, and people are finally discovering their voice and realizing we don't have to be kowtowed. We can own our power, our ability to tell the people in Washington, you work for us, I don't work for you. I'm sending you my money, I've hired you, and I can fire you at will. I think the federalism model gives me a lot of hope because we see migration patterns within the US. The fact that California is going to lose a congressional district, yeah, I'm happy about that. And also the fact that it's jumped the shark, like Proposition 47, which Kamala Harris helped to put through, which basically allowed theft up to $1,000 in CVS and other stores. Shahzad Bogden was driven out of office, the Soros-funded prosecutor, in quotes, prosecutor. So to see him driven out and to see people going to states like Florida and Texas, that gives me hope because it shows that the American model of federalism is alive and well, and that we, the people, really are the centers of power. And also with my women's group, Independent Women's Network, we've grown. We have more than 30,000 women all over the country in different chapters. We have a chapter here in Colorado, and we're pushing back. And May and Paula, who spoke on the last panel, we're passing laws and getting executive orders to define explicitly in law what is a woman, recognizing, you know, the rights that flow from the biological differences of XX versus XY. So we're not afraid. So I think that's the most thing that gives me the most hope is I'm not afraid anymore. We're not afraid.
Brad?
Yeah, I think one thing that gives me a lot of hope is that even in the background where all this political dysfunction is going on, America is still doing amazing and great things. Can anyone here name a European tech company?
Skype?
Apple? No.
Skype?
Skype, maybe? I don't know.
Swedish?
Right, but so Meta, Google, Facebook, all the innovation is still very much happening here in America when it comes to AI, when it comes to social media, when it comes to technology. I mean, we all walk around with supercomputers in our pockets. Many other things just in my lifetime. Since I was born, cancer treatments have progressed radically. So many more people are able to live such longer lives after getting diagnoses that when I was born would have been a death sentence. So I think it's very easy to just get caught up in the kind of political toxicity, and we do have to be worried because a lot of the innovation and spirit of private enterprise that is driving these forces is under threat. But even as things have become more dysfunctional over the last several decades, we're still doing great and amazing things. And I think that gives me hope that while we're rightfully pessimistic at times about the state of our politics, there's still many areas of American life where we're truly still embodying American excellence.
Tom?
On domestic policy, I agree with social mobility of capital. You can move your business, your income, your family to a different state. That limits the kind of oppressive tax regime, regulatory regime that exists in a lot of Europe because you simply lose too much capital. As an extension, you know, I also think that in the foreign policy domain, the systemic decline of the Chinese economy is a cause for hope because we have been incredibly stupid in the last 20 years in terms of our preparation to deal with China. It wasn't until Donald Trump took office that we stopped appeasing them and started dealing with them. And that's a relatively bipartisan thing now. We need to do a lot more. But China's population, they don't have enough jobs for young people. They have huge amounts of debt loads, especially in their real estate market. Xi Jinping is so obsessed with state control and the Communist Party rule of law that he destroys any private innovation because people are too fearful to either get on his bad side and essentially just not. And that is just that the economic impacts that state model is causing for them in a kind of poetic way, right? That it is the communist model again meeting a better American counterpart with all the caveats that I've said about some of the policies from the left. But I see that as a cause for hope because we do not want China to be the dominant global power.
I've got some great audience questions for the panel, and for this one, I still want everyone to chime in. But this time I'm going to start with Tom, work my way backwards. This question is, what would your greatest advice to former President Trump be?
Oh, I think what I said earlier, stop engaging in these stupid personal attacks that serve no purpose. I mean, they make him feel good and they make an element of his base feel good, but they don't persuade the electorate, and it's about moving the needle. So focus on policy. I mean, he can own, I would think, most independents would say the economy, the border, national security, innovation, the rule of law. I mean, this should not be complicated, and the counterfactual to that is, what does Harris say if he focuses on that in the debate? She said, and she distanced herself, say, don't take my word for it, don't take her word for it, look at her title. Are you the vice president? Have you been with Joe Biden? Anyway, that's my advice. I find it frustrating.
All right, Tom, we do have a challenge from the audience. Someone has actually asked the question, is Trump's focus on personality actually bad, though? Hillary Clinton lost because she was unlikable. Candidates tend to win or lose on likability. Shouldn't we focus on Kamala as a person, not solely policies?
I think there's a fair, rebuttal there in the sense of Hillary Clinton's arrogance, corruption, etc. But from my perspective, Trump's approach towards Kamala Harris in particular has been more vested. Is she black? Is she Indian? And this kind of, just this petty stuff that is not rooted actually in a personality critique vested in a kind of policy approach that someone has taken. I think they're different things.
Hey, Brad, our initial question, what would your greatest advice to former President Trump be? To be fair to the audience questioner, they specifically wanted to know your advice for him to win over Gen Z voters, but I thought you should answer this question. Sorry, Tom.
Oh, okay. Well, the Gen Z voters is a little bit of a twist. But more generally speaking...
But give both.
More generally speaking, I would say look at what worked last time and maybe reconsider some of the new ideas that he's running on. Because what was successful about his economic record in the first administration that Trump had was traditional free market policy, largely, right? Supply side reforms, corporate tax cuts, a personal income tax relief for most Americans, large scale deregulation, and it led to a thriving economy. But he's running on some more protectionist, pretty far out there ideas like a 10% flat tariff, not just on China, but on imported goods from anywhere, which would make average American households' expenses go up by thousands of dollars after years of inflation where they can struggle to make ends meet. So I think he needs to pivot back towards some of the stuff that worked well the first time and less away from some of these new populist ideas that actually often sound like they're coming from Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders repackaged. As far as winning Gen Z, that may be a little bit of a lost cause, but I think he could mitigate the damage by threading the needle on social issues in terms of striking this right balance of pushing back on the woke stuff and the insanity, and there's a million genders, but not going so far to the other side that you're alienating people who are more moderate or more independent. And I think on some issues he's struck that balance appropriately, but on other issues he's still working that out. But I do agree with what Tom said, that attacking Kamala personally in terms of her record as vice president, in terms of even her horrific cackle, that might be effective, but arguing she's not really black or that kind of thing, it just falls totally flat with younger people. They roll their eyes at him and they say, okay, boomer, right? So that is not what's going to be effective, I don't think.
Carrie, what's your advice for former President Trump?
I would say enroll people in the vision of the results that you already gave to the country. Under Trump, we had women, Latinos, African Americans, Hispanics have the highest wages, net worth. I mean, it was phenomenal. And so talk about that and contrast it with the poverty and the 20% inflation that Kamala Harris behind the scenes pulling the puppets because, hiding who Joe Biden really was. By the way, I think Trump should explore whether he can get senior voters who are much more likely to vote. And the fact that they threw Joe Biden, a senior citizen, under the bus, I mean, to me, that should be a huge red flag for senior voters, how Kamala Harris doesn't care about you from a personal standpoint. But then also with, again, the foreign policy. We had no new wars. I mean, look at Putin. Putin invaded under George W. Bush. He invaded Georgia. He invaded Crimea under Obama. He did not invade anybody under Trump. And now he's invading Ukraine. So show that. Show the compare and contrast of your results. In the Middle East, we had the Abraham Accords. And under Harris, we have war, bloodshed, chaos. That's really what he should be focusing on. Results, his real results, and her real results. In terms of Gen Z, I used to lead outreach for the Coke Network for young people. What was fascinating is that young people want to walk or have it both ways. They said that they favor communism or socialism over capitalism. This is what young people say. But then they also are the most aspirational to start their own businesses. So they're kind of contradicting. They don't understand what socialism is. So my advice is to appeal to that impulse, that entrepreneurial impulse that Gen Z has. They want to start their own business. They want to be part of the hustle culture. That's really what Trump can tap into.
Kaylee, what's your advice?
Yeah, I think that sort of what you guys were touching on, which is to focus on the issues, but specifically the issues that voters will recognize most directly. I think it's important to keep in mind that the vast majority of voters are not policy wonks. They don't know what price gouging means. They don't know what Kamala Harris's $25,000 housing handout would do. But they do recognize the impacts of inflation because those are the prices that they see every single day. And I think it's also important to recognize that Kamala Harris is exploiting low information voters with these policies by bribing them. That's what she's doing. It's the exact same thing that Joe Biden did with the student loan bailout. And so I was actually talking with Dan about this at dinner last night. And he recommended, if Trump got up on a stage at his campaign rally with a bag of groceries and started going through every single item that he had up there with a before and an after of what it cost when he was president versus what it costs now, that's a massive statement because that's something that voters understand. Every single voter understands, including Gen Zers. And I think that what Trump needs to do is really hit the point that these prices are never going back to what they were when I was president because of Joe Biden. The only thing that you can do now is stop them from getting higher under Kamala Harris. And that is what Gen Zers understand. I mean, I have not bought my first home yet. I would absolutely love to. I can't because of a Joe Biden presidency. We young adults, even if they tend to be more socially liberal, those are the things that we do understand, and we will vote on those issues in November.
What's your advice, George?
I mean, I think that really Carrie hit the nail on the head. I would just underscore that it's a broader thematic issue that President Trump could invoke, and I think, to be fair, does invoke. That it's something like the comparison between Reagan and the kind of distinctions that he drew between himself and Carter. The fact that all sorts of adversaries across the United States, or excuse me, across the world are moving against American interests, that's very dangerous and disturbing. I think that Tom's right to point out China's systemic economic decline, but I don't think that means that China's necessarily in the box for a long time or parked, to use the language of the Biden administration. President Trump should be raising again for people that we have these decade-long struggles that he made tremendous progress on during his administration. There's been a reversion by the administration that even tried to sort of replicate what he did. So that would be, I think, the kind of thematic tone that I would urge him to take.
Amber?
So I think people have covered pretty well the fact that Trump should be focusing on the issues, and I 100% agree. So I will go to a sort of different point, which is that I would urge Trump to make sure he's surrounding himself with people who have both his and the country's best interest at heart. As excellent as the first Trump term was, I mean, we got the tax cuts, he cracked down on the border, he held China to account, he deregulated the economy. I mean, just amazing accomplishments. It could have been a lot better, actually, but unfortunately there were people in the administration who were actively working against Trump because, unfortunately, he can be kind of susceptible to flattery. And there were people that he brought on who did not believe in the Make America Great Again, America First agenda, and who were there for personal reasons and tried to basically cut him off at the knees and implement whatever they wanted. And so I just hope that this time around, Trump has learned from that first term and is going to pick the best people to actually implement this vision for the country that is going to be hugely impactful in a positive way for the American people.
We had a few members, thanks. You can clap for Amber's answer. Yeah. Thank you to all of you for those great answers. I wish you were all advisors to former and possibly future President Trump. My next question is from the audience. There's a couple people in the audience, it seems, have taken issue, Brad, with your use of the words free market and protectionist, and so let's talk about that a little bit more. The questions from the audience are we playing semantics when we use the words free market and protectionist? Are we using those words to manipulate the public? Many free market policies have been more corporatist than genuinely capitalistic, and protectionist policies are often policies to counter our economic adversaries' hostile practices or drive strategic domestic growth. And one more similar question, someone asked about protectionism. Can you play devil's advocate to support Trump's economic policy that has been labeled protectionist? Hasn't the free market policies the GOP has followed hurt many Americans? So how do you respond to those challenges?
Well, the GOP over the years has not followed free market policies. They've done massive corporate bailouts, special interest loopholes. I mean, they've been very much a corporatist party, not a actual free market capitalist party. So to invoke that as the record of the GOP, I think is a incorrect starting point. I also will say about protectionists, I don't know, when Trump is talking about a 10% flat tariff that he wants to implement, that is on everyone. That's on our allies. That's on Canada. That's on Mexico. That's not just targeted to China. That's not just targeted to hostile countries or countries that are using slave labor or any of these things that maybe are more narrow things, because there are always exceptions. But generally speaking, Ronald Reagan, everybody on the right for a long time realized that tariffs are taxes that ultimately affect American consumers. And a free market approach to trade is what's corresponded with some of the greatest increases in living standards in human history. Obviously, we need to protect our intellectual property. There are narrow exceptions on specific things, but across the board restrictions on trade that Trump's now flirting with, I think can absolutely be fairly characterized as protectionist.
I want to open this up to the rest of the panel if anybody wants to jump in. I think Amber, let me let Amber jump in first, sorry.
Yeah, I'd love to play the devil's advocate here. I think it's important to understand what's been happening to the American middle class, and particularly manufacturing in this country. We have lost the ability to make things in America, and unfortunately that's led to a working class that is in despair. It's why we see overdose deaths, the use of fentanyl and opioids exploding in our rural communities. And so my pushback would be, I think it's important to recognize that if America is not creating things, if we're not building things, we're leaving behind an entire class of people who are vital to the growth of this country and its economy. And as much as a tariff would increase prices marginally, there's a whole lot of people who don't have money to buy goods in the first place. So there is a trade-off there.
I'm going to let Carrie jump in and Tom, because I saw them trying to do so a moment ago. And then unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap this panel because we're running low on time. But Carrie.
Yeah, I would agree with what you said about blanket tariffs, sort of mindless tariffs for their own sake. I think what I agree with Trump did was that he sounded the alarm in a lot of ways that we were asleep at the wheel as it relates to how we were shooting ourselves in our own foot. So for example, with China, we had elevated them to most favored nation at WTO. And I was shocked. I used to host a talk show for John Solomon, and I remember doing some reporting, a segment on, we used to basically allow Chinese companies to have weaker accounting standards in order to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, this, and the justification was like, well, they're a developing country, so like we won't have to have the same standards that American companies would have to be listed. That is mindless to me. And so I think that was sort of the alarm that Trump was sounding, that we should not be taken advantage of as it relates to tariffs.
Tom, bring it home.
Yeah, George made the point on China, and I think maybe yes, China I think is in systemic decline, but that makes them potentially more of a threat in the short term. The reason I mentioned that is in terms of domestic manufacturing, our defense industrial bases, specifically in shipbuilding, is woefully inadequate to the challenge we face. We don't have a carrier strike group in the Pacific at the moment because the only one that was there has been sent to deter Iran. So there is a rationale to create well-paying jobs in a defense manufacturing base. I think that would make a strategic investment. But I'm always skeptical of the idea that government using tariffs to reinvigorate or support different areas of the economy is beneficial, because it essentially admits in a socialist way that the government knows better than millions of individual choices every day. And again, with tariffs, ultimately, yes, it will help some people. It will help some people a lot. It will help some people who are struggling a lot. Pardon me. But at the margin, it's also going to increase costs for everyone in the country. And that is a reality of it. And we've done this before, right? In the 1920s, it's also, if you do a 10% tariff on the rest of the world, yes, tariff China, great. I think that's wonderful. You do it in the rest of the world, did we not think they're not going to do it back to us? I mean, and you create, again, the economic decline in the 1920s and 30s. This is economic history. I do not think is broadly supportive of Trump's tariff agenda.
I think we could talk with this group for another hour or two and dig into these issues and even more. I hope that if anybody in this room happens to have a direct line to former President Trump, you want to get us an audience with him, these guys would be great. They should talk to them. We should all talk together and work together. These are some of the leading voices out there for our values and for the founding principles of this country. We may not always agree on all the specifics of every public policy matter, but boy, it's a hell of a debate when we get together, because these are some smart, very sharp Blankley fellows. So please join me in thanking them.